All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Department of General Services Juneteenth Celebration. My name is Jasmine Adamola, and I am a manager with the Enterprise Planning and Inclusiveness Division, otherwise known as EPIC. And I am truly humbled and honored to be assisting with this very special day. Myself and my colleague Meredith Frazier are so pleased to be serving as your MCs today. Part of EPIC's role is to promote awareness about diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the workplace. And this event was planned in keeping with that objective. Today, as you all know, we have an amazing guest speaker lined up for you. But first on the agenda, we will start off by hearing a few words from the amazing director for the Department of General Services, and then we will welcome our guest of honor. Before we get started, I do want to go over a few housekeeping tips. First, this celebration is being recorded and it will be distributed to all staff at a later date. Second, due to time constraints, unfortunately, we are not able to take questions from the audience just because we do want to honor Secretary Weber's time. Third, folks are welcome to turn on their cameras if they would like to do that, just so that you can feel a little more engaged in today's celebration. All right, with that being said, we will go ahead and get started with our celebration. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the incredible Director for the Department of General Services, Director Ana Lasso.
Thank you, Jasmine. You are too kind. And thank you to the entire EPIC team for putting this together. And a very special, immense thank you to Dr. Weber for being our special guest today. Hello and happy Juneteenth to you all. Today, we are gathered to commemorate a meaningful moment in history. It's even more significant because we have a very special guest of honor, our California Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber. Secretary Weber is a dynamic and phenomenal leader who has a tremendous passion for advocating for fairness and equality. By the age of 26, she received her BA, MA, and Ph.D. from UCLA. Go Bruins. But just before receiving her doctorate, Secretary Weber became a professor at San Diego State University. After 40 years, Secretary Weber retired from the Department of Africana Studies and went on to pursue a career as an assembly member. Ultimately, she would serve 4 terms, representing California's 79th Assembly District, which includes parts of the city of San Diego, as well as several cities and communities in the San Diego region. Her equity-oriented legislation includes school finance and accountability, classroom safety, ethnic studies, early learners, attendance and dropout rates, quality instruction, and much more. Then, on December 22, 2020, Dr. Weber was nominated to serve as California's Secretary of State by Governor Gavin Newsom. By January 29, 2021, she was sworn into office. She's not only California's first Black Secretary of State, but she is also the 5th African American to serve as a state constitutional officer in California's history. Secretary Weber has worked diligently over the years and has obtained many accolades. Today, we are honored that Dr. Weber will be sharing more information about her life, her legacy, and especially as it relates to this important holiday. Juneteenth commemorates the fateful day on June 19, 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger and his troops traveled to Galveston, Texas, and announced the end of the Civil War and the institution of slavery. This monumental holiday marks the date that thousands of slaves finally learned about their freedom more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge how meaningful it is that we are celebrating Juneteenth with California's very first Black Secretary of State. As a daughter of sharecroppers, Secretary Weber learned the value of hard work and tenacity from her parents. Secretary Weber embodies what the African American community has endured since slavery was abolished. Let's give a warm welcome to California's Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate so much the opportunity to be with you on this extremely important day. We have a brief period of time to talk about Juneteenth and the significance of it in so many different ways. As pointed out, I'm a daughter of a sharecropper, and those who have any sense of African American history or just Southern history in itself, you learn very quickly that sharecropping was about a half step above a slave in terms of people not having certain rights and opportunities. At the time, my father was a sharecropper, even though his family owned land in Arkansas. You were forced to work someone else's land, always to keep you in a subservient position, so that you never felt that you'd ever be their equal, or that you had any opportunity or responsibility to respect yourself as well as, and they had all authority to command respect. And so it was a difficult life to live as a sharecropper. And so it reminds me and makes me think so much of Juneteenth, because just being able to think about it, extrapolate what it was like 150 some odd years ago during this time frame. We often ask questions from the present rather than looking at it from the time frame it existed. Like, why did it take them so long to get this information? Why weren't they informed earlier? Why did it take 2.5 years for them to find out that they were actually free? And it goes on and on. But if you've not had an opportunity to see how that system works, how the system of discrimination and degradation works in a community and in the life of individuals, and how people feel so vulnerable in those environments, it's difficult for you to imagine, because you're looking at it from the present as to what you would do versus the past. My father left Arkansas when I was the youngest in the family at the time, because his life was threatened. He was going to be lynched. And if you know anything about lynching, you know that there is no justice. There is no effort to get justice with regards to lynching, because if you pick up any book on lynching, you will see hundreds and hundreds of lynching scenes where people actually showed their faces. They didn't hide. They didn't pretend that they didn't do this. They were proud of it. In fact, they create pictures and make postcards to mail up to their relatives and talk about the wonderful lynching they had the night before, or the barbecue. So this is an environment of tremendous amount of intimidation and very little, if any, justice at all, because the Supreme Court had already declared that there was no right that a Black person had that white men had to respect, which was one of Taney's laws. And so as a result, there was tremendous amount of injustice, and there was no way out that you could see for yourself. And so oftentimes people did have to leave in order to get to other places like California, where there was a little bit more freedom, but still limited justice in many, many ways. And so when we look at this whole issue of the fact that it took 2.5 years for all Africans to be free, you have to put it in context of the conditions that existed. It was during a war when Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863 by Lincoln. It was designed to end the war and to hopefully provide some change in the larger society. But simply because it was signed by Abraham Lincoln and went into effect January 1, 1863, did not mean that people were immediately freed, because the South didn't recognize anything that the North did. And so as a result of that, you find that people were not freed until the Union soldiers came to town and would take over the town, and would then declare that this area was free. And so at that point, then freedom came to those places. So as a result, because Texas was not a part of the Confederacy at that time, it was not a Confederate state, but it had slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't necessarily apply to them, because it applied to those who had been a part of the uprising in the South. And so therefore, they were not freed until Lincoln declared another freedom. And as a result, then they were informed several months later that they were the last place really in Texas that had authorized slaves that were there. We learned later on that there were still pockets of slaves throughout the United States as people didn't get information. But the idea that in 1865, when they came, and Juneteenth, when they came to Galveston and informed them that they were free, these folks were still operating that they were slaves, that they didn't have rights. They knew nothing about the war had taken place. They didn't know the outcome of it. And it almost sounds impossible for us, because, we live in an era where CNN is 24/7, and you hear the same news over and over all day. So it's almost impossible, if you turn on CNN at any moment, that you're going to miss a little bit of the news. And so this came into existence, that this freedom that they discovered happened at that time. And so Texas became the place in Galveston where the last slaves were freed legally in this country. And so it's interesting because as a kid, I grew up not even thinking about Juneteenth. Some people mention it occasionally, but it was a Texas thing. It was what people in Texas did. It wasn't what people in Arkansas did. It wasn't what people in Mississippi did. It was a Texas thing. And everyone I knew as a kid who talked about Juneteenth at all were from Texas, somewhere from Texas. And Texans were pretty adamant about theirs, much more than others. Texas folks would not go to work on June 19th. My friends' parents didn't go to work on June 19th. They declared that their 4th of July. So they were pretty adamant about it. And those who weren't from Texas just thought it was something that the other people did. And it was kind of interesting and what have you, but they still celebrated July 4th as the Day of Independence. And so it wasn't until really more recent, and probably the last 25 or 30 years, that others began to see Juneteenth, understand Juneteenth, and began to celebrate it. And so as a result, it has spread to the extent that now it gives us a much broader view of all the folks in the nation, actually now with the federal government declaring Juneteenth as a holiday, California declaring it earlier than the federal government, and more recently declaring that it's a paid holiday. And so as a result, people can participate in Juneteenth with some level of comfort from the government that they can do it, and they can do it freely and openly. It wasn't so in the beginning. In the beginning, people had celebrations, and they were called jubilees, but they were not as well recognized, and they were not as easy for people to do. That there had to be sometimes the persons who owned the place didn't want them to have these Juneteenth, these celebrations, these jubilees, because they didn't want to remind it that this was a freedom that they had, that they still restricted their ability to celebrate the holiday and to declare themselves free. Because obviously, if you're a sharecropper in the South, and more than likely when your freedom came, most of them were going to become sharecroppers because they had no other means of employment or support. And so they worked those farms, but they worked those farms at the direction and the peril of those who owned them. And as a result, they continue to live in very limited facilities, limited housing, places where they lived in. And as I said, lived under strict rules and regulations about what you can and cannot do as a person who's a sharecropper. So it makes me, as I talk about Juneteenth, and I often don't spend a lot of time talking about the historical facts of it, because that's stuff you can easily read, and you can read it. And when I've taught history for the last 50 years, I generally like to ask myself the question, what do I extrapolate from this history? Because history is something that is designed to do more than just help you memorize facts and figures. And I think we understand that now as we have more access to technology, that you can pick up your phone and Google Juneteenth, and you'll get a whole bunch of stuff coming at you from Juneteenth. So being able to memorize the facts and figures and the dates and places is important, but it's not as critically as important as to think about it and to come to some conclusion about why is this happening? Why do I need to celebrate Juneteenth? What does it remind me of? What should it motivate me to do? I always tell young folks when I'm talking to them that, Juneteenth is important because it also emphasizes what happens when you don't have the capacity and the ability to read and think for yourself. What happens when rules are made and you can't read them? What happens if laws exist and you don't have the capacity to understand them? And as a result, you then are still trapped in some way and owned by those who have the ability to do that. If you can't read, if you can't decipher information and those kinds of things, then you're going to be at the mercy of those who can, and they will interpret it for you, to their advantage. And they may have heard, those who were slaveholders may have heard that everybody had been freed in January, but they were not likely to tell their slaves. They were not likely to tell those who'd been enslaved. Why? Because that's free labor. And the longer you don't know that you're free, the more free labor you give. And you give and you give. And so why would anyone want to tell you that if they could get free labor from you? And so it was not like the people in the city didn't know, but those who were on the plantations did not know. And it wasn't until the general came to Galveston that shared it with those individuals who had been enslaved that the law had passed and they had the ability to basically be free. So I always tell folks, I always see this as your freedom is yours to own and to protect. and you can't give it to anybody else. And the same is true when I tell folks about voting. Voting is for you. This is your power. This is who you are. When you give it up, you give up your power. You give up yourself. You give up your identity. You give up your ability to control your life. And so when you look at Juneteenth, you say, wow, 2.5 years, you were already technically free and you didn't do anything about it. 2.5 years, you could have gone anywhere else and you could have basically established a life for yourself without a slaveholder coming to get you. And you had that power, but you didn't know because you couldn't use it because you didn't have the ability to understand it. You didn't know what was being said. You had been kept from reading and writing and those kinds of things. And as a result, that's what happens. And so I say this to young folks all the time. If you're going to control your life, if you're going to control your existence, and I say this to older folks as well, because sometimes we don't want to know anything. If you're going to control yourself, you got to have all the knowledge that's necessary to do it. If you don't, you operate on false information, and others who have the information then control you. And so it's imperative that we understand, as I look at Juneteenth, this is what I come up with. I come up with the fact, yes, that it took 2.5 years, but why? Because the people themselves weren't reading, were not able to read. Those who knew the information were not going to give it to you because it was not to their advantage to do so. And so you then end up giving away 2.5 years of additional free labor because you didn't have the information that's necessary. And so then it becomes important for us to understand the power of knowledge, the power that people have to control, and that this is it should remind each one of us every day how much we would have given away because we didn't know, because we didn't have the information, because we weren't a part of the knowledge base that was there. And many people tried to keep us from having that information. It's important to understand that even after Emancipation Proclamation and even after Juneteenth, folks still didn't always give the information that was there. Knowledge is power. And so people would try to restrict those from learning, try to restrict them from having the knowledge that's necessary, restrict them from admissions to schools, restrict them from voting. It's always interesting to me that the two most powerful things that change a person's life is those two things that we write the most about. One is reading and literacy and making sure that everyone can do that. And oftentimes we don't put as much energy into making sure that kids who have the least amount of resources in a society actually have that ability to read and write. And that's why I put so much of my energy when I was in the legislature on opening up opportunities of knowledge for everyone. That's why I spent 40 years of my life teaching Black studies, because I know that knowledge is power, and that you teach history not because I can't memorize the facts. We teach history because it develops a character. It helps you understand who you are. It helps you look at your past and create a different kind of future for yourself. And so as a result, these things are critically important as we talk about what we're going to do and how we're going to operate. And so then it becomes important that we do this, that we understand the power of knowledge, a power that we have as control, and obviously the power that comes with self-determination. How do you decide your direction? How do you decide you're going? And you want to have all the tools necessary to be able to do it. Those who came out of slavery, who got the knowledge and the support, did certain things that should be examples for us that were really important. Most people don't know that Black people started Sunday school. Everybody thought that was a church-started event, and yet Sunday schools were started because Black people wanted to learn to read, and the only time they had, because they worked so hard to read, was on Sunday, and they went to church. And so Sunday schools became the places where they could learn to read and write. Powerful efforts. And most of us think it was just because of the religious thing, and that was part of it. But the only time they had available to them was on Sunday. And so they started Sunday schools within the church. And Sunday schools would teach them to read and to read the Bible, to basically learn to read. And that became a critical part of those who had been enslaved having the opportunity to read, because they hadn't developed enough schools at the time for kids to read. And eventually they did as they went along, but they never gave up Sunday school, because Sunday school was time for adults to learn to read the Bible, to have some sense of literacy in their community. They understood the power of lack of knowledge. That when you don't have information, you don't have the knowledge, you are vulnerable, and you're a good subject for being taken advantage of. The other thing, of course, is they began to talk about voting for elected officials. And some of the first Black elected officials occurred during reparations, during that time frame after 1865 up until 1877. This whole idea of people being elected office. Why? Because they were the victims of people who were poor administrators, poor elected officials who only passed laws to benefit themselves. And so they became involved and they began to create legislation and things that were beneficial. And some of those pieces of legislation exist today. In fact, one of the most important pieces of legislation they did was to make schools free. Rather than having to make schools available to poor people to be able to go to school for free, paid for by the government. So for a number of years, for about 12, 15 years, there were Black elected officials in the South. Eventually, when Jim Crow laws changed, and therefore all of those folks were thrown out of office, and you have all these other things that were created that blocked voting. But voting was a powerful base for many of them, and they understood what happens when you can get good elected officials into office to make a difference. So as we talk about Juneteenth, and I see our time is drifting away, my 10 minutes is about up. But let me say that anytime I look at a piece of history, and I spent history, taught history for many, many years, and I always welcome the opportunity to have conversations about history and what it means. Your history is extremely important. You know, I used to tell folks in the legislature that of all the subjects that we study in schools, and I had done some research on this when I was a grad student. I was trying to figure out what was really important and what was not and why we do it. Of all the subjects we study in school, history is the only one that we studied the most all the time. If you think about it, when you go to elementary school or you go to middle school or high school, even in college, you're constantly taking courses in history forever. And you think to yourself, I already studied that stuff. I already know about 1492. I already know about 1776. I have read this stuff. I know this stuff. I know the history. I know about World War I, World War II, World War III. I mean, you can go on and on with all these different things that we have as historical facts. But history classes are not designed to actually teach you just the factual information. Because you learn that and you wonder why you have to keep going over it over and over again. And some of it you forget. But history is designed to develop the American character. You learn history because it teaches you to be an American, for the good or the bad. You learn to appreciate where you live. You learn to, and the absence of history tells you how great you are. I mean, when you have history in your books, it tells us how great this country is. The absence of you in history, whether it's women or people of color, also emphasizes maybe that you weren't as great as other people. And maybe you didn't do as much. And so oftentimes when I talk to young people and I ask them some historical facts, they don't think Black people did anything. They don't think Latinos did anything because they don't know the history. They've not been taught the information. And as a result, then it becomes difficult to develop a real sense of self and importance in that history and in yourself. As I have over the years studied more and more history, I have come to appreciate myself more than ever before because I've learned the struggles that others have gone through, and I've learned the sacrifices they have made for me to get the things that I have. I also realized at some point that given how far we have come, that if we really think about it, there's very little that we can't do in terms of innovation and creativity and those kinds of things. You know, I went to a place called the island of Gavay, and when I was in Africa, and it was interesting to me because this was an island. I was in Benin, that had built in the middle of a lake. It's hundreds of years old, and what happened was there was a vicious king, a Benin king who was very vicious, but he was superstitious, and he believed that if you ever cross water to engage in a battle, you would lose the battle because you shouldn't cross water. In other words, leave your place. So people who were afraid of him built in the middle of a lake an island, built a people-made island that is hundreds of years old. Now, these are folks without any excavation tools, without concrete, without anything. And to be able to take this boat that's a very short ride to the middle of this lake in Benin and get out and walk on this island where they have built schools and churches and houses. And all this is built in terms of the sticks in the ground and so forth. So, I mean, it was amazing. amazing to be there. But it also made me realize how brilliant these folks were in terms of science and math and engineering. Unbelievable. Unbelievable kinds of things. And so what happens is that when you study your history, you not only learn about the facts, but you learn about the innovation of people, the ability to thrive, to grow, and to develop. And that's what happens when you really begin to understand your history from whatever vantage point you're in, that it is amazing history that helps you to not only just appreciate them, but also know the potential that you have as a descendant of them. And so when you study history, you really are studying yourself. You're learning what people had to do to survive, and you're learning how they did survive. When you study about the Black Wall Street and Rosewood and all these places, you learn about the fact when people tell you Black folks hadn't done anything, you learn very quickly how innovative they were, how they believed in business, how they developed businesses, and the forces that they had to work against, that worked against them to actually accomplish the goals that they wanted to accomplish. So it develops in you a real sense of pride, a spirit of determination. It helps you understand who you are and what you need to do, but it also inspires you so much more to believe, to move forward. When I think of my father and the journey he went through to get his kids to California, and his vision and his dream for his daughter and his sons to be able to do certain kinds of things, it gives me extra appreciation of where I am and who I am, because I know how far I've come because of him and my mother. And so it really is important that we think of Juneteenth and we look at it as a historical piece, but it also is a reflection of all of us as to what the journey has been for some, that has also been for others, and how we have to work very hard to make sure that this journey that we're on, that they have sacrificed to get us here, is not been in vain, that we will continue to move forward, and we will continue to grow and to be better, that we are a nation that is in flux, that we are basically, as we put, developing a more perfect union, which means we're not perfect at all. It's a recognition that there's much work to be done, but we should have the confidence to know that we have ancestors and we have those who believed in this nation and the change that needs to happen to help us to stay strong and focused. So once again, have a happy Juneteenth. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of your celebration. I wish you well, and I hope that the things I've discussed with you briefly give you a framework for when you're looking at history, you recognize the power of the individuals who have done it, but more importantly, that you're just as powerful as they are. Thank you.
Dr. Weber, thank you so much. This has been a powerful 20 minutes. Everyone here, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Weber. We appreciate you. I can't wait to spend some time reflecting on what Dr. Weber was talking about. We teach history to develop character, to help you understand who you are. And that's what today is. This is a day that we celebrate together. I also got themes of hope and determination from Dr. Weber today. So I just really appreciate all of you who took the time to join us for this wonderful, wonderful celebration, this opportunity we had. Like I said, a powerful 20 minutes. I love it. But so in closing today, we would like to leave you with an inspirational dance performance meant to symbolize the spirit of Juneteenth. And we hope you enjoy. And again, thanks so much for joining us today.